All right, well, I think we'll get started, everybody. So thank you all for being here. I'm Hannah. I'm the board president at the Jonathan Fisher House. I wanted to say thanks for coming here on a beautiful evening after a few days of rain. I'm very impressed that you all decided to come spend an evening inside with us. I want to say a big thank you to the Blue Hill Public Library for co-sponsoring this and hosting us. They're always a big joy to work with. And this is part one of our two-part symposium at the Fisher House. So we've got some great lectures for you tonight. And then tomorrow at the house from noon until 4, Nevan, who's about to speak, will be actually doing some hands-on demonstration of creating a reconstruction of Fisher's workbench using period tools and techniques. So that's like kind of open house. You can come right at noon and stay the whole time. You can drop in for 5 minutes and take a look, whatever you want to do. And Nevan will be there working on that and answering questions. So we hope you can join us tomorrow as well. But for tonight, we've got two great speakers. So Nevan Carling is on our board at the Fisher House. He is a timber framer specializing, come on in, you can grab seats. There's a few in the front, there's a bunch in the back still. Nevan specializes in preserving historic timber frame structures using period tools and methods. And then after Nevan speaks, we'll have Tom Lee Nielsen of Lee Nielsen Toolworks. Tom is actually a direct descendant of Jonathan Fisher, which is a very cool connection. And of course, he's the proprietor of Lee Nielsen Toolworks down in Warren. So he'll be speaking a little bit about the present day use of these kinds of hand tools and the legacy. So please join me in welcoming Nevan to get started. And we're going to have a lovely night. Come on up, Nevan.
I've gone to wireless now instead of having a paper script. We'll see how well it turns out. Yeah, so, well, thank you for the introduction. I guess I don't really need to introduce myself anymore. It is on the description, but yeah, I work mostly doing preservation, timber framing, kind of all around New England, but currently I'm in school in England for timber building conservation, the master's degree in timber building conservation, which, you know, they've been fixing buildings in England for a long time. So I'm hoping to kind of bring a lot of that theory and practice back over here. Hopefully get to use it on places like the Fisher House and other historic frames in New England. But tonight we're talking about kind of an overview of historic woodworking in America. I went for the alliteration, Fisher Furniture in the Future, but hopefully it all blends together. I realized that in the description on the website, it mentions specifically about plank framing in the Fisher House, and I don't have any slides about that. So if you came specifically for that, I'm really sorry, but I can talk to you about plank framing for a long time, which is not very fun. Anyways, so maybe, there we go. Humans and other hominids have been manipulating trees and wood in some form for millennia. A recent archaeological discovery in Zimbabwe shows two trees that have been joined together by a notch cut with stone tools. And it's been dated through luminescent dating, which is an insane thing that we can do, you know, when the last time this saw light, to about 476,000 years ago, right? Yeah, I said that right. Demonstrating that our ancestors' ability to work and combine objects, or it demonstrates our ancestors' ability to work complex objects and combine them into really interesting forms. I mean, it doesn't look like much, but for being almost 500,000 years old, it's pretty impressive. Woodworking was even completed by other hominid species. The Schöningen spears excavated in the mid-90s in Germany are attributed to either Homo heidelbergensis, which is an earlier hominid species, or our cousins, the Neanderthals. We gave the Stone Age its name more likely because of a preservation bias in the archaeological record. Rather, woodworking has undoubtedly been a fundamental part of our evolution. And unfortunately, evidence for it that goes this far back is pretty limited. But yeah, these are almost, 3,500 years old, 3,500 years old. I'm not saying that right, but it's amazing when this stuff does survive. And it just shows how deep in time we have been using trees to our advantage. Every culture on Earth is responsible for some kind of woodworking, whether it is like the ceremonial hunting mast of the Yupik in southwestern Alaska, which you can see on the left, where wood is obviously not abundant, but it still is, it features prominently in their culture. Or the like the Onbashira ceremony in Japan, where trees are ridden off the mountain from which they are cut into a river and then floated down to be processed as part of a temple renewal ceremony. It's insane. And every time they do it, someone dies. I mean, so, or almost every time they do it, someone dies being crushed, you know, so it's clearly high stakes woodworking. But today, we're mostly going to be focusing on English and American woodworking practices from the 17th, 18th, and 19th century. This is much more recognizable woodworking for us here in New England, as many European woodworking traditions were transported across the Atlantic during the process of colonization and then adapted into American traditional forms of woodworking. And I will get back to this painting later. This is a really cool painting. I will say, oh, there we go. I found the right place. So furniture building in the 17th century, sort of more specifically post-medieval furniture, is really quite bizarre to our modern eyes. Pieces are lavishly decorated with carvings and highly embellished with intricate turnings. Joining and turning were generally regarded as two different trades, and back in England, there were strict rules about the separation of these trades. But meanwhile, in the American colonies, these trades did still tend to remain separate, but this is more upheld by tradition than any sort of like meaningful legislation. But you can see, I mean, this is just a bizarre looking thing. You know, I think this is from Essex County, Massachusetts, and it's hard to read, but it says 1688 on the front of it. But it is, you know, you wouldn't find this really in anyone's home nowadays. Likewise, in where I'm from, in the Connecticut River Valley, we developed our own kind of unique take on this type of furniture building. They're kind of broadly called the sunflower chests because the carving featured on the front of them is a sunflower. And there are two shops, one in Wethersfield and one in Guilford, who made these chests prolifically through the 17th and early 18th century. But even so, you know, this is a little bit simpler, but almost every facet of these chests are decorated in some way and not austere in the kind of New England Puritan mindset that we attribute to this period. While there is ample 17th century material culture to study, including furniture and tools, we sadly don't have any complete tool chests or workshops from the 17th century of a New England joiner. I don't know about in England, but I'm kind of doubtful. However, we do have a lot of insight into what may have been in an average joiner's tool chest through Joseph Moxon's books, Mechanic Exercises. This book was written as part of a trend beginning in the 17th and really taking form in the 18th centuries in England of books specifically about professional trades. Moxon describes in detail multiple trades in this book, including smithing, joinery, and house carpentry, illustrating the tools required in each trade and providing explanations of how certain tasks are undertaken. He defines joinery as an art manual whereby several pieces are fitted and joined together by straight line, squares, miters, or any bevel that they shall seem one entire piece. And even though these are pretty garish objects, you know, they fit the description. They do look like one entire piece. Taking Moxon at face value, we see that many of the tools used in the period are still being used well into the 19th century, some of which we actually see in Jonathan Fisher's own collection. Notably, the spring pole lathe, although Fisher has quite a unique take on the spring pole lathe. But other, you know, objects are obviously wooden planes, a workbench similar to that of Fisher's, except that it has a vise, chisels, saws, squares, miter bevels, all these things that, you know, a lot of the forms of these tools have not changed in a very long time. But moving on to the 18th century. Woodworking in the 18th century is much more represented, both in its study as well as in the varied amount of surviving material culture that we have. There are amazingly well-preserved workshops, account books, and tool collections of some of these prolific woodworkers. Some of these collections are accessible to the public, while others are tucked away in museum collections or in someone's attic. So if you know about any complete woodworking sets, tool chests in your attic or someone's attic, please let me know. But the Seton tool chest from 1796-97 is a really interesting kind of case study to begin with. The story of Benjamin Seton, or the story starts with Benjamin Seton, who was born in Chatham in 1775 and was the son of a cabinet maker and a church elder. For his 21st birthday, his father bought him a complete and very expensive set of woodworking tools at a cost of 15 pounds, 10 shillings, and 4 pence. Seton was tasked with building the chest for his new set of tools, and after he completed building the chest, he promptly closed the lid and pursued a life as an auctioneer and an undertaker. Seton planned to immigrate to America. However, these plans didn't come into fruition, and he remained in England until his death in 1830, after which the tool chest remained in the family until being donated to the museum they're at now in 1910. Remarkable preservation of Seton's chest and tools is largely due to him not really ever using them. And it's another interesting thing is that almost all the tools in this chest came from the plane making shop of Christopher Gabriel, who was a very prolific London plane maker and toolmonger. And Peter Gabriel, the singer, is directly descendant from Christopher Gabriel. So Peter Gabriel's, umpteenth grandfather made those tools, which is really funny. However, coming over to America now, the Downland workshop in collection comprises an 18th and 19th century cabinet maker, clockmaker, and blacksmith shop. Multiple generations of the Dominies worked and created furniture and other goods in between their shops and their home, which were kind of one and the same, offering one of the most complete collections of tools, as well as completed furniture, associated completed furniture in America that's attributed to the Dominies. It provides an unparalleled insight into the layout of shop spaces in the 18th and early 19th century and reveals just how much of a cottage industry some of this was. And it literally took up most of the Dominie's house. So this was the workshop as it was documented in 1933 before they tore down the house and workshop. Well, actually, this is even more funny, and I could talk about it. I'll talk about it on the next slide. So yeah, there's the house. This is the woodworking shop or the carpentry shop, and the clockmaker shop. You can't really see what it was over here. They tore down the house because it was sort of in a derelict condition. The DuPont family ended up buying the contents of the Dominie shop and moving it to the Winterthur Museum, where they replicated it. And then the clockmaker shop was actually moved down the road to a parking lot and became a gentleman's club for like 60 years. It's really, it's 15 by 15. It's very intimate space. And now the East Hampton Historical Society in Long Island actually commissioned a reconstruction of the house based off of the Historic American Building Survey drawings. They moved the clockmaker shop back from the parking lot and turned it into a clockmaker shop and reconstructed the workshop. It's a really insane story, but you can see, just how integrated, woodworking and all their other trades were with their lives. And funnily enough, the carpentry shop is located right next to the kitchen. So after a hard day's work, dinner is not too far away. But you have to, moving around their house is moving around their workshop pretty much. So it is a very interesting study in how people lived on top of most of the time the work that they completed in this period.
Nevan, where was it?
East Hampton, Long Island, New York.
The original.
The original, and it's still there. The new house is there, and the original clockmaker shop is still there, and the workshop is now in Delaware. So it's all publicly accessible. And there is a great book that's very expensive that you can buy called With Hammer in Hand by Mark Hummel. Yeah. But moving into the 19th century, another remarkable survival is the tool chest and tools of famed American cabinet maker Duncan Phyfe, which are now housed in the collections of the New York Historical Society. Phyfe was born in Scotland and immigrated to America and is credited for helping usher in the Sheraton and then the American Empire furniture popular in the first half of the 19th century. His workshop and warehouse, although no longer extant, are indicative of a more urban workshop and craft tradition. For Phyfe, his workshop and home were separate spheres from one another. Business and work happened in different spaces from his domestic life, and differing or contrasting from country craft traditions like those practiced by the Dominies before, even though East Hampton, Long Island is hardly anything like a country setting now, or Fisher. And it's amazing that someone painted his shop. What a beautiful space. I think this was his warehouse and his workshop. And I'm not entirely sure if this is his house or not. It is very cool. And his furniture is still really relevant today. Unfortunately, for being such like a prominent American woodworker, the only photo of his tool chest is like this horrendously low quality photo. And then there's no other information about it. The only reason why I knew about it was just like a happenstance visit to the New York Historical Society when I was in New York City. But they do have a good exhibit there about it. Anyways, I mean, here's a Duncan Phyfe couch with Obama looking at himself in the mirror. This is in the green room of the White House. So clearly his preeminence is still understood today. His furniture lives on in our nation's capital. And then this is a very beautiful table that he made, or his workshop made. And again, here, here's the associated tools that made that table. It's pretty amazing. It's not a lot of, I mean, it is a lot of tools, but not by our standards now. Fisher, in essence, was no different than Phyfe or the Dominies. His shop was at home. His tools were homemade, and his furniture was decidedly his own. Fisher himself was working within a long-standing tradition among woodworkers on both sides of the Atlantic, although his tool chest is, or I should say, although his tool chest, which is here, is a rather simple affair compared to that of Benjamin Seton or Duncan Phyfe's. Its simplicity but elegant form reflects the furniture its tools could produce, I think. Fisher's furniture and tools provide yet another unique insight into the craft practice of this period. We're talking about now the 19th century still. We not only have his tools and the furniture he made, but we also have his diary, which sets this collection apart from any of the previous examples talked about. Fisher's firsthand account of his process is truly unprecedented in the study of historic woodworking. And although Fisher has been studied in many other angles, the body of work related to his woodworking is fairly scarce. I mean, we have Hands Employed or Right on the back table, and that's sort of like a great overview of Fisher's work, but it's not, it's not a sort of an archaeological understanding of Fisher's woodworking. And you may recognize the person in this photo, and this person as well. But again, just like Phyfe's beautiful tool chest, beautiful tools, and the beautiful furniture that he is producing, height of American furniture making industry. Jonathan Fisher's more simple, little more austere, like the man himself. Tools are reflected in, the sort of simple un-American country style of his furniture. But it's all of it is perfectly utilitarian. So, kind of covered some woodworking or some woodworking history. This is like take this with big caveats. This is very broad. But we're going to talk about kind of how it works, or the basics of pre-industrial woodworking. This is a great scene from the 18th century, from a French stencil. I think it's Granger. I should have cited it, but I stole this photo off of a website that I had to pay for the photo. So I didn't want to reveal with the link. But anyways, you can see a ton of processes going on. You got a trink bill or a timber cart for carrying all the timber. You got a guy with a stick who's telling everyone all the layout, essentially, this is my foot, this is the foot you're going to use. Got a guy hewing, we have a door and an architrave. Got a guy cutting mortises, we got guys pit sawing. We have the construction of multiple buildings that don't know how they relate to one another. It's a very in-depth photo that talks about pretty much all the processes that are going on, at least in the carpentry or the house writing trade, but its applicability is also within furniture building. And I told you I would get back to this photo. This photo is awesome. Prepping stock well and efficiently is by far the most important process undertaken in any wood shop, whether it is historic or modern. Although the method may appear crude to us now, stock preparation in the historic wood shop was completed with relatively few tools. Stock could be hewn with an axe. It could be riven or split with a froe and wedges. It could be sawn to the correct size, or it could be planed to the desired dimension. Almost all of these actions are depicted in one scene captured in John Hill's interior of a carpenter's shop at 40 Hill and Field in England. John Hill was also a carpenter in this shop. It was his father's shop, actually, and then his shop. And I believe this is a self-portrait of him at the workbench that he's also, he's painting the scene. He's got some other really interesting paintings. Another interesting character that people haven't really researched very much. Anyways, so hewing and axe work. Hewing and other forms of axe work appear to be a rough way to work with stock. However, contrary to this opinion, the axe is a tool of refinement and delicateness. It can be used to roughly thickness a piece of wood, bringing it close to the final dimensions. Depending on which axe you're using, and depending on the user, it can even shape the complex geometric shapes, or it can shape complex geometric shapes with a high degree of accuracy. This could be like a table leg or a chair leg, like the typical Georgian clawfoot table leg. A lot of that work would be done with an axe. The very basic work, but it's pretty amazing, the delicateness of those pieces of furniture start off with being, hacked at. It's unclear what the carpenter was shaping with the axe in Hill's painting, but clearly its placement in the center and front of the picture gives eminence to its place in the pre-industrial workshop. And I like especially the inclusion of the offcut, that is the carving stump, which is a very ephemeral part of many workshops that you don't find in antique stores. But it's an extremely important part of the historic workshop. But yeah, I really don't, these are kind of too thin to be anything, but I don't know what he was depicting. Long shavings, yeah. But, oh yeah, you're right, actually. They're like from the sides of a board.
They could be tools.
It's a nice axe, whatever is awesome. I want that axe. Riving is the act of splitting wood along its grain, and is another essential function of the pre-industrial wood shop. It too looks cruel. Excuse me, I need some water. Put the water somewhere. Yeah, there you go. It also looks crude, and as if the woodworker has little control of how the wood is splitting. However, when used in combination with a riving brake, another very ephemeral piece of the pre-industrial woodworking shop, the user can control exactly how the wood splits by changing the way, the amount of pressure on the top or the bottom of the piece. It's really hard. It's kind of hard to explain. But essentially, if you're splitting with a froe and you've got the piece of wood further back into the riving brake, the top part of the brake, this cross member, exerts pressure down as you're cleaving the piece open, and depending on where that pressure is, you can move that split through the grain. So and when you get good at riving, it's very quick and very, very accurate. And it's also, you can just create a ton of material super fast with riving. You know, the what's being depicted in the pictures are fairly large pieces of timber, but you can go down to it's how they made lath before they sawed it out, you know. So you're going down to 1/4 inch laths or even smaller sometimes. So, you know. Yeah, exactly. Which is impressive because like the oak that you see that's growing in Europe, it's just like so so twisted. Even like in historic buildings that are, you know, riven. I've seen lots of riven panels in medieval screens in churches, and it's crazy how they were able to get such nice pieces of oak out of very twisty and cross-grained logs, rounds. Anyways, this procedure of sawing something can be done in a variety of different ways. Cross-cutting, in which a piece of sawn is, or which a piece of stock is sawn perpendicular to the grain, is not a very difficult task, and is fairly rudimentary. In stock prep, you know, you're cutting things to rough shape. Sawing, cross-cut sawing, like shoulders and furniture, is a highly skilled task. The most important thing in cross-cutting for stock prep is making sure that the length you're cutting is correct. Measure twice, cut once. Board stretchers still haven't been invented. However, rip sawing, or sawing something or the stock parallel to the grain, is much more difficult and laborious. Rip sawing in the form of the trestle sawing, which is this is trestle sawing. Or seesawing. I can't remember. Yeah, this is technically seesawing. There's many ways to saw a board. Is necessary for even creating stock, you know, the boards that you are then going to further prep in places where they didn't have access to sawmills like we did here. I mean, the sawmill was one of the first factory machines produced in America. I think like 1628 on the York River was the first sawmill in America. They were building them right off the bat. In England, however, they didn't have sawmills, and a lot of stock prep was done at the pit, the trestle, or the seesaw. Other forms of rip sawing may take place in the shop, where pieces must be sawn to a final dimension. This could be like veneer, which is also sawn in a pretty similar way as on the lower right. In Hales painting, a young person, probably an apprentice, is rip sawing board as part of stock preparation. And he's using a very English piece of furniture called the sawing bench, which is super handy. It's a type of viceless bench where you're using your body weight to hold the piece as you're sawing it out. So maybe he's sawing out, you know, this is a 1x6, and he's sawing out 2x1 pieces of stock for muntins in sash windows or something like that. Apprentices did a lot of that work. There's the 18th century cabinet maker shop on the Harewood estate outside of Leeds. They have a lot of their account books. And it's like 6 a.m. the apprentices get there and saw until 6 p.m. essentially. It's like all day, so that the masters and the journeymen in the shop can spend the whole day cutting joinery essentially and not doing what is menial labor. Lastly, planing and thicknessing of boards is generally the final step taken before a piece of stock can be marked and cut for furniture production. Planing itself is broken into multiple different steps, starting by thicknessing with a scrub plane, and I have a bunch of planes here. This is like a German style scrub plane. It has an iron that is heavily cambered, or radiused, so it can take off a large amount of material at once. It also has a much more open mouth, so that material can be evacuated. This is a German scrub plane. English foreplanes, European foreplanes look a lot like all the other planes. They just tend to have a wider mouth and heavily cambered iron. Let's see. Once thicknessed, the board can be jointed on edge. Well, it depends on what shop you're doing. There's these procedures can be kind of fudged a little bit. And to joint the board on edge, you use a very long plane called the jointer plane. And usually when you find these in antique stores, you'll see that down the sole of the plane, they're actually very dipped because of how many times they've been run at the edge of a 1x or 1.5x board, essentially. They're not using generally the whole thickness of the sole. They're using just the very center. You'll also see that dip reflected in the iron itself. It's worn out in more than one, in the center rather than on the edges. I just lost my plate. A jack plane, after you've jointed the board, which gives you a nice crisp edge to set your square on. A jack plane can be used to remove the material on the face of the board, so perpendicular to that edge that you just jointed, in order to make the face of the board square to the edge. And a jack plane is sort of like a four-plane, except that it's called the jack plane. It's the jack of all trades. It's sort of the average of all these planes. It's average in length. The mouth is an average size that's open. The camber is not too great, but it also still is cambered. So it does a little bit of everything. And at the end of that process, after you've planed the face close to the dimension, the smoothing plane can be used to smooth the surface of the board down to its final dimension and also give the board a good appearance. I don't have a smoothing plane here. I just didn't bring it up. I forgot to bring it. I have a nice English infill smoothing plane that would have, like, people would have went, ooh, but I forgot. In John Hill's painting, you can see the guy in the background here is planing boards on an English style workbench. And these guys really are the other unsung heroes next to the apprentices who are sawing all day. Planing all day is tedious and hard work. There was an article that was written in Mortise and Tenon magazine, I think the last issue of Mortise and Tenon magazine, about the David Whittier house in Jericho, Vermont, which is like late 18th or early 19th century. It's a house museum. And the person who wrote the article wrote it from the perspective of rebuilding the sash windows, but he did do rough calculations of just how much work went into planing a fairly simple building. So the 1x and 2x stock that made up the trim of the building, I think amounted to planing nearly 7,000 lineal feet. And that's just one aspect. That isn't necessarily prepping the stock for the doors or the windows or the finish trim. It's crazy. These guys are in an average day walking miles back and forth on their bench, on a 9-foot bench. It's pretty impressive. So yes, sawing and planing are what made the woodworking world go round. In choosing a design, you've done all that work, you've planed, you've sawed. What are you going to make it into? Pattern books, which began to emerge in the 18th century in England and a little bit before in the 17th century, and then were widespread in America by the 19th century, allowed carpenters to be exposed and to execute certain styles of furniture. The continuous publication of these books, in turn, also meant that fashions and tastes more readily changed through these periods. Templates could be derived from these books, making life easier for the joiner or the cabinet maker, as they could easily be repeated, or they could easily repeat certain elements of furniture. You can see the templates hanging above in the reconstructed Downland workshop. I think these are all various legs and chair arms right above the workshop. Which also tells you what they were making a lot of, and they're very close to the bench. The historic templates like that are really rare, as they are often destroyed as tastes evolved, and a certain style of chair leg was not needed anymore because no one was producing those chairs, and they were thrown into the into the fire. So if you know about a collection of historic 18th or 19th century furniture templates, also let me know. That would be very cool. I had a point and I've completely forgotten it. Oh yes, the kind of lengths and periods of furniture. It's sort of like, you know, it's an exponential growth curve. What we're seeing at the beginning in the 17th century is part of a long holdover that's coming out of medieval Europe. And then the 18th century rolls around and furniture does change. You know, we see what we begin to understand is Georgian furniture, you know, Queen Anne into, I can't remember what my Georgian furniture is now, but the relationship to one another is much more apparent. And then the 19th century hits and it's like, you know, you go from Sheraton to Empire to, I can't remember what comes out like in the 1860s, what it's called, but everyone hates it. It's like that really heavy Gothic furniture that looks terrible, you know, and that's within 15 and 20 years of each other, which is a very fast, you know, turnover rate for a lot of this furniture that's being made in mass constantly by these small shops. And lastly, oh man, I'm gonna have to go through the last bit fast to stay on time. All the processes I just mentioned are physically demanding and often tedious, though I do enjoy planing. I don't like sawing when I do it. With that in mind, it's no secret that pre-industrial woodworkers only completed work that they had to do. The underside of Fisher's drawer shows this sort of juxtaposition between the smooth sides of the drawer and the really nice dovetailing against the rougher drawer bottom. That you can still see the deep grooves in it from the scrub plane on this, and you can see that he did smooth across the grain, it looks like, with a finer plane. The sort of these faces, these places are often a great way to tell what tools are being used to produce a certain object. The underside and backsides of furniture reveal, I think as Joshua Klein says, the warts and all. And provide a valuable insight into the methods used to construct each one of these pieces. So, you know, you can look at this. We know there's a foreplane or a scrub plane. There's a smoother, you know, plane, or then there definitely is a smoothing plane that's been used to dress the sides of these drawers. You can see, you know, the saw was used, a saw and a chisel were used to cut the dovetails for this drawer as well. And it's through that sort of process, that investigation, that you can begin to rebuild any one given carpenter's tool chest when they don't survive, which is most of the time.
What secondary wood is he using? Just curious.
I think this is all pine. I'm pretty sure this is all pine, but he was selecting the pine. You know, this drawer side here is knot free, whereas the drawer bottom is full of knots. It's a much worse piece of timber. So he did have, he was using quite a lot of discretion in that way, selecting what material also will save him the most time in cutting it. If he was smoothing out a drawer side with a ton of knots, it's going to take a lot more time than one that is free of knots. Maybe this is, I'm not entirely sure. This might be a maple. I mean, it's from his bookcase, which I don't know what it's fronted with. You may know, someone might know.
€1 for a chest, one chest at the Holt House that we looked at, and it looks like the secondary wood, the cheap wood is white pine.
Yeah, it's almost always white pine. Just it's so abundant in that period, and it's so buttery to work with. It's much nicer than spruce. Yeah, I'm not entirely. Anyways, can return to that idea about, I can't remember what he fronted that bookcase with. Anyways, why is it relevant today? And also historic woodworking today. You know, we can learn a lot of lessons from historic woodworkers and apply those to modern woodworking shop. And I was talking about pit sawing earlier. Here's two friends of mine. They've set up, based off of a stencil, 18th century stencil, a pit sawing setup, to great success. It did not take us very much time to saw that board. But it's amazing when you get people using like traditional hand tools, the positions that they take when they're using them are exactly like the ones that are depicted historically. It's really funny. Like, this is totally, I wish I had a stencil really similar to this, but I know there is one. Anyways, the beauty of these pre-industrial workshops is that they were able to produce high quality pieces of furniture that directly serve their community. Fisher often writes about who he was making a piece of furniture for, and even notes the day he delivered the finished product. This idea of local production means that generally materials should not travel far from their source, cutting down on wasteful transport costs in the modern day, like the idea of shipping Douglas fir from the west coast of America to build houses here on the East Coast when we have abundant white pine. Crazy. The quality of goods can be much higher, and the relationships through work can be built throughout a community. Relationships like those between the logger, the sawyer, the furniture builder, or the house builder, and the client are all interrelated and should not be separated from one another. This is a fun project I did with Will, who's up here, the upper dog in this pit saw. A friend's house needed a new sill plate on this on his carriage house, and so we dropped the tree up the hill from his house, maybe like 500 feet. We skidded it down on the snow. We heated it in place, and we had a really awesome lunch, which I wish I had a picture of. And all in all, from felling the tree to being done with the timber, it was about 3 hours. That's local production, you know.
I was
Yes.
just wondering about, do you guys often use green wood, or do you have a certain moisture content that you try to shoot for?
It depends. If you're a furniture builder, you want, you know, very dry wood generally. But for us in the timber framing world, we want it green, especially when we're working with hand tools. There is a lot of debate.
Why is that?
The wood's propensity for movement as it dries out. So generally in furniture building, there are allotments made in the joinery for the wood to expand and contract without, when the equilibrium moisture content of the wood changes seasonally. Whereas, I don't know, I mean, there is a big debate in the timber framing world, or at least in the preservation world, about whether you should or you shouldn't use green wood in preservation work. And I think it's kind of, you know, it's dependent. If you're cutting a scarf joint or putting in, you know, replacing part of a timber, you know, a historic timber that's already dry, it's better to use wood that has a close enough equilibrium moisture content. But with this, the whole sill's gone, you know, replacing it wholesale, and the posts, you know, the sill is in compression from the posts, and then the you know, and being fully supported by the foundation. So it's not going anywhere. Yeah.
The whole structure is being supposed to be always constantly. So
Yeah, there's
move, warp.
yeah, this is an unheated woodshed. You know, I mean, the wood in timber framing, especially, wood will stabilize itself very quickly. The joints are designed to hold, you know, themselves in those swings. I think a lot of the movement in a timber frame really happens in the first couple of years, and then it's, you know, it's kind of negligible how much it's moving due to change in moisture content.
Used to let ships sit on the stocks, good for like a year or two, let everything settle.
Yeah, yeah. So, no, you want to cut, especially, yeah, you want to cut stuff green. You want to cut the frame green, and let it dry together as well. Boom. All right, hold on. I'll be done in a second, I promise. The other thing about these local shops is they allow for the reestablishment of vernacular or regional traditions. This could be like local architecture, in the praxis of construction, or in the furniture and goods being produced in any one area. Historically, apprentices learned a certain practice of carpentry in their shops, or in the shops that they were working in. And when they left, they carried that particular practice with them wherever they went. This means that workshop outfits or outfits of carpenters were able to develop unique styles or characteristics in their work, giving us the variability in our built landscape and our homes that we all appreciate. The sort of sameness of the American house, both inside and out now, is becoming a serious issue as people now look to reestablish unique characters in their communities. And this is a project that I did with Everett, which is fun, where we scribed an outdoor timber frame as part of a class, but it was largely based off of like regional New Hampshire building traditions, and I think it remained in New Hampshire as well. So, and oh no, it went to Vermont. So someone in a couple hundred years who's building archaeologist is going to go, I think that's a New Hampshire frame, you know, up here in Acton, Vermont. but that's important. That's a lot of what I do is look at things and go, this doesn't, this seems like an outlier, and why is it an outlier? But it's cool to be able to work in that tradition, to be working in another vernacular, essentially, when constructing something. And lastly, we got lessons in efficiency. Small shops can offer us a lens into how doggedly efficient they were, out of necessity, given that without machines, simple tasks were often laborious and time-consuming. How can it be that workshops located in barn annexes or the back rooms of houses could produce high-quality pieces of furniture that still outpace some of the major modern manufacturers? Modern practice and historic practice is a bit like comparing apples and oranges, but the gap between them should be lessened in order to create what can be much more sustainable, more fulfilling, and a satisfactory standard of work. And again, going back to the store bottom, Jonathan Fisher was not lazy, but this is what efficiency looks like. The lessons, a lot of these lessons, and we talked about it a little bit on my tangents, are important for preservation work, at least in my life. And I hope to impart at least some of this into the efforts now going into restoring the Jonathan Fisher House. Already we have sought out local craftspeople to begin preserving Fisher's house. Everett is our local craftsperson who is restoring the windows for us. And we hope to continue embodying a local and sensible approach to the work going forward. The tools, the furniture, the building, and the buildings all remain as testaments to the timeless nature and enduring practicality of their construction. And that's it. I was pretty good. Pretty on, Tommy.
Yay, welcome, Tom.
We've got a couple of.
Oh, you got your props.
You still down?
Just a couple more back here. Well, I'm just gonna pass them around, so. I'm just pass them around, as long as they all show up at the end. I won't have to search you on the way out.
Yes.
Can't hide them, they're scrambled around if you don't.
Yeah. No light fingers.
You're gonna have to oil these quite a lot.
Yes, that's true. Okay, well, that was really interesting. And thank you. And thank you for inviting me along as well. So I make modern hand tools, which is kind of an anachronism all by itself. People who do woodworking for a living today, of course, generally, not always, use machines to some extent. And a lot of our customers use a combination of machines and hand tools. And the kind of tools that we make are pretty much specifically for furniture making. They're not for timber framing, they're not necessarily for boat building. Luthiers like our kind of tools, furniture makers, and to a lesser extent, the other trades. So it's a little specialized in that regard. There are certainly people who try to do all hand tool woodworking today, either for fun or to prove a point or just because they're stubborn. But like I said, a lot of people do blended woodworking with hand tools, and the hand tools therefore are the tools that are not replacing the apprentice who's planing all day long and sawing all day long, but replacing or updated versions of the tools that the master would have used to do the joinery and the finishing. So there's a bronze smoothing plane going around. That's a smoothing tool. There's a small block plane, and there's actually two small block planes, and then there's what's a jack plane size tool, which represents more or less all the tools that you need, except for a joiner, which is a very long tool, as we were shown earlier, for straightening long edges primarily. So I got into this because of certain strong influences in my life, one being my father, who was a boat builder. And I was sort of sweeping shavings as a kid for many years. In the shop with these, this was in Rockland, Maine. And initially his crew was small, 3 or 4 men. And they were in their 60s and up. And they were just great to be around, remarkable. I mean, I didn't think it was anything strange, but it certainly was. In those days, this was in the 60s, wooden boat building was dying out in Maine. Well, it's pretty well dead at that point. There were a few people building lobster boats and maybe 1 or 2 building pleasure boats. My father was typically doing pleasure boats, so, but out of wood, which was, you know, this was the transition to fiberglass. So that influence, another influence in my life was Francis Herreshoff, who was a yacht designer. And he was an autodidact, just like Jonathan Fisher. He went to MIT for a little while and got bored. Then he designed most of the most famous sailboats, racing sailboats in the 20th century. And Jonathan Fisher, in a way similar to being around the boat, was kind of part of my life growing up, this guy, and reading Mary Ellen Chase's book. And when I first visited, I was, you know, about that tall, with my grandfather, and who's a fisher, and who I wish I tried very hard to find a picture that I have somewhere. That's a picture of my grandfather and Jonathan Fisher's portrait, and they look exactly alike. It's uncanny. So they're about the same age, you know, when Jonathan painted his portrait, my granddad. So those influences were important to me. And all of those things showed me that you could learn to do things yourself and didn't have to necessarily go to school to do that, although I did. So I was an English major. And after school, I went to New York and got a job with a company that sold woodworking tools, most of which there were high quality woodworking tools, most of which were made in England or Germany or Japan. There was very little in the US at that point. Stanley was, after the war, making garage door openers eventually, but DIY tools. So their professional tools, which were astoundingly good pre-war and earlier, they just abandoned that altogether. And a lot of the specialized tradesmen's tools that they made, they dropped them first. And those were the tools that customers would come into Garrett Wade, was the company in New York, and ask for. Can you get me a whatever? And the answer, of course, was no, unless you could find an antique. Generally speaking, antiques were more expensive than a working man wanted to pay for a tool, especially the more obscure tools. So that was interesting. And then there were a few people during my 3 years there, about 1 year, who made some interesting tools to sell through Garrett Wade in their garage or basement or something. And these were people who were interested in the idea of tool making, but weren't necessarily, you know, able to produce very much, and they're always out of stock of them because they're beautiful, people like them. So I got interested in making these tools through one plane. And then, my dad, who's a great deal older than I am, wanted to retire, which he said many times throughout his life. Took his last job when he was 94 years old, but he decided to sell the boat shop. And I came back from New York to think about taking that over, but it took me a little while to get out of New York. It took me too long because he sold it a couple of months before I arrived back in Maine. I thought boat building, the shop, we made the wooden boats and we also made all the hardware. So there was metalworking going on. Pretty rudimentary, but still. And I thought, that'd be a nice place to make some tools. But that didn't happen and I started on my own. So what I have is a small series of slides from the early days, which was on a farm in West Rockport, Maine. And then I have a short video here of a really abbreviated version of what we do now in Warren in our shop, which is a lot of times people think that we make hand tools, so we must make them with hand tools. Same thing, take way too long and too much work. So the shop you will see is pretty normal. But on the other hand, we do almost everything at the shop in Warren except making castings. Now, the 17th, 18th century woodworkers were using wooden tools, but not long after Jonathan Fisher died, large-scale production of metal tools became the norm, and people switched, or some people switched. So our tools are based on, most of our tools are based on Stanley tools, which was the absolute leader in the field, except for some certain specialized tools that are based on some English models. But I do not make reproductions. So if you have an old Stanley plane, I'm sorry, I can't make you a part for it, because my parts don't fit necessarily. So there were certain things that in the first approximately 10 years of my business was an extended apprenticeship, self-apprenticeship. And there were various things that I learned and decided that I wanted to do. So one thing you'll find, well, old wooden tools often have fairly thick blades, but Stanley tools did not, and ours have much thicker blades than Stanley planes. That jack plane that's going around is like that thick, twice as loose, twice as thick as a Stanley plane. I like that because it makes the tool more rigid, less prone to chatter, like the weight, especially in a block plane. And then using bronze. I started with bronze because we're making small tools and didn't want them to rust, but also, more importantly, bronze does not break. You drop it on the floor or cement floor. And you, in fact, can bend it back if you happen to bend it out of shape or out of whack, which is nice. And then it's beautiful. So that's the boat building part, is the bronze and wood thing going on. And then I discovered there's a kind of iron that is also unbreakable. Pretty much absolutely unbreakable, called ductile iron. And when I started making iron tools, I started using that. Generally speaking, our tools are a little heavier than Stanley's. The blades are harder, thicker. And then we put a lot of work into the way the handles are shaped and made and feel in your hands. There's some design changes. Some of the tools, I am fond of low angle planes, which most of those are that are going around. So some of the tools at Stanley never made low angle. I make low angle. Bench planes, I don't, but updated materials and the blade we now are using a type of steel that wasn't available 100 years ago, that I think makes a better blade. It holds an edge really well and lasts a long time. So tried to re-engineer and update things. The other general principle was to make the fit and finish and all the moving parts work together to a much higher standard than they would have been. And on the other hand, I went to visit Stanley once in New Britain a year after they moved their entire plane making production to England and stopped in New Britain. And there was this big basketball court size place where the machinery had been. And, it's like, how many tools did you make? Well, we made about, 30,000 tools a month. I'm like, well, I don't make those in 2 years. So scale is another aspect to what we do, small scale. So, been doing this since 1981. And that was in the 60s, the boat shop in Rockland. Me and a friend from school, and a few of the workmen there, putting the masts in a ketch that my father rebuilt, 56-footer, traditional plank-on frame. This is a first glimpse at the property I bought in West Rockport after moving back to Maine. Old abandoned classic cape with a barn that fell down. And my little lamb. We, of course, were the tail end of the back to land movement. So we had a cow. This is a picture of a Stanley low angle jack plane that's going around and one of ours. And you can kind of see some of the differences. I'm certainly not saying the Stanleys were bad tools, they weren't. Here I am making a block plane, bronze block plane. Worked by myself for several years. Eventually, after a few years anyway, I was able to buy a full-size milling machine. I started on a really small one. And then this is kind of the heart of the matter. In those days, I was really lucky because it was about a mile away from my house was a fellow who had a small foundry, and he made a lot of boat hardware and stuff. And I was very small scale, so he made the castings for me, and he was mostly an artist. He did some boat hardware, he did some glass blowing, he did sculpture and various things. So he wasn't really motivated to do my tools. And after a year or two of first having him do my stuff and then working with him to help him do my stuff, I'm still not getting enough tools. He helped me set up this foundry, which I used for about 4 or 5 years. In total, we did casting and mooring for about 6 years until it was no longer really feasible for us at the scale. So this was all manual. It was completely manual. That's a pile of sand. There's a shovel somewhere. Mostly what you did was shovel sand. This is a molding machine, which I got about halfway through, which compacts the sand in these things in the front, which are the finished molds that have been poured with bronze. But this made a lot of castings for quite a long time. That's pouring bronze. And there are some more representations of our tools, spoke shave, modern design, the spoke with a chair maker from Kentucky, saws, which we started late in, well, I guess mid-90s to make joinery saws, back saws, dovetailing, stuff like that. And another nice shot of one of our big joiner planes. So there's that. And then we need to get to Hannah needs some help there. Get out of the black screen. I'm also happy to have questions if anybody has questions. So yes.
On the one plane that you came around, the larger one, the center of the sole is slightly inset.
Yeah, that's a only one I had to grab. That is made for fly rod makers.
Oh, okay, that's the plastic.
Yeah, and so they use it on a metal form and they like to have a, you know, relieved in the middle so they don't plane their form.
Do you make your own back saw blades?
We do.
You
And
cut those?
hmm?
How do you cut the teeth? Do you have any pictures of that?
Yes, no, not with me. We now grind the teeth, which is the way the Japanese saws are made. We used to hand file them. And I have a man working for me who hand filed, let's see, 11 million teeth, I think he did. And he couldn't do it anymore, so I said, we're not gonna do this. I have to find another way. So we started grinding them. Okay, hit play. Yes, okay, good. We can interrupt this as we go. This is the pattern maker. I have a pattern maker working for me that's been there now 32 years. Putting together pattern for the foundry. This is, the pictures in here are of the iron foundry, which is in Lewiston. It's the, I think there's only 2 foundries left in Maine. This is one of them. And I've been working with them since 1990. So I don't know if you know much about casting, but this man made most of our molds for many years. So this is a pattern here. It's upside down. The detail is in the bottom, and it's packed in a flask, top and bottom filled with sand and compressed. Then you remove the pattern and you put the top on, and you pour metal in, and in the cavity that's left where the pattern was, hopefully you'll get metal. That is essentially how it works.
Do you control the moisture with the sand, or is it?
Absolutely, it's critical. Too much and you make a bomb. Too little and it falls apart. And that's that's like sharpening your plane blade. That's the most important thing you do, is keep your sand right in a foundry.
How long?
Oops,
When you
sorry.
do a casting, how long do you stay the same?
That's an interesting question. You could go lots of ways that way. Basically, until it's relatively cool. So you don't, if you push it out or dump it out too early, it can get distortion. But I like to keep it in even longer till it's quite cold, so that you don't get stress. So there's this whole thing about, I don't know if you've heard, well, in the old days, they used to leave castings outside for a couple of years and have them season. That's why it's called seasoning. I'm actually not sure if that's absolutely true, but the fact is that these castings, when you make castings, they get stresses in them, depending on the shape you're casting, and you have to get rid of the stresses. One way to help that is to let them cool off slowly in the sand so that it doesn't create the stresses in the first place. That's not the only thing we do, but that's part of it. Basically overnight. Now they're pouring them off, dumping them out. Enterprise does a lot of really big castings, so they got a lot of big equipment. Now we're gonna go into the machine shop and show what we do. This is a CNC milling machine. And I'm just, they're just really kind of brief. That process takes longer than that. A little hand deburring. And then these plates are machined separately and fit into one of those tools that went around.
How many castings do you reject?
Way too many. That's a hard question to answer. Let's just say that you constantly try to do better.
Yeah.
Right. So a lot of checking takes place throughout the process at every station in the shop. And in this case, we actually match up these plates to the bodies, which means they're not interchangeable. A little bit of handwork. Somebody who's really good at it. And we've got a really great group of people. About half of them are new since COVID, however. This was filmed, most of this was filmed early COVID. The foundry portion is 15 years ago. We then powder coat them. These are the iron plates. We do not, obviously, powder coat the bronze, but we polish them. So powder coat is a kind of coating that you spray on and then bake it. So it's not quite Japanning, but it's not paint. I'm not sure anybody knows exactly how to do that anymore. So we don't have very many of these machines anymore, but this is how we used to do drilling and tapping. Most of it's done on computerized equipment now. But it's the same idea.
So start to finish, how long is this whole process?
That's another interesting question. A batch of tools usually it's 150 to 250, somewhere in there. And usually we're talking, it could be getting the first ones out of the batch after having started them, could be a matter of less than a week. But getting the entire batch done is probably more like a month, because we're working on different things at the same time. We try not to, drag it out, but depends on how urgently we need them. On the other hand, there's a lot of handwork involved, so it takes a team of people to do it.
The machine rates seem really, really fast. You're moving the tool head really quickly. Is that because of the skill you use?
No, it's just good, fast machining, and most of it's carbide tooling, which cuts fast. Yeah, you move right along. We're not taking heavy cuts, typically.
Can you describe in a little more detail how you keyed off of the Stanley designs to create your designs?
Yes. I would take them, original one, and look at it and decide what I want to change, and then we'd make a model. Sometimes using a cast from the Stanley one, but more often building one out of wood, metal, and plastic, various components, some of which are shared with the other tools, so we have standard parts. And then work with a pattern maker to get it to feel the way we want it to feel. Then we would cast it in plastic and get it cast in the foundry and then get samples back and evaluate that again. So it might go through a few cycles.
So this was really a reverse engineering technique.
Yeah.
As opposed to seeing the plans that Stanley might have.
Oh,
filed
right.
With the patent office.
Yeah. No, and I was, looking for something different from what they did as well. And I don't still like to, I like it in my hands. I don't want to do it on CAD. So. Checking for, this is checking where the blade sits, checking for taper to make sure that where the portion where the blade sits is parallel with the sole, which is pretty important, and we check all of them. We check them actually both in machining and grinding, which is what this is.
Pretty low reject rate.
In terms of rejects that we have for things that we call machining defects or errors, which is our fault, it's pretty low. In terms of problems with castings, could be widely variable, depending on a variety of different things, including foundries being sold and going to new foundries and them learning and all that kind of stuff. I've been looking for some other foundries recently, and there used to be about 20 years ago, 6,000 foundries in the United States. There are 300 now. Thank you, globalization. Sorry. But the fact is, it's really tough to find somebody. So if you're trying to look for a bronze foundry, out of 300 foundries, how many cast bronze? Out of the 50 or 60 or 100 that cast bronze, how many do anything other than plumbing fittings? Not many. So finding the right fit's tough, because most of what we do, there are lots of there's some art foundries. They're not interested in production. They're not going to do production work. So we're in an interesting conundrum where we want our tools to be really nice. We want really nice castings. The old Stanley castings were gorgeous, beautiful. No holes in them, just smooth surfaces, really, really nice. And the bronze as well. And most foundries are industrial operations. They just want to churn stuff out. So I had a discussion a couple of years ago with one of my guys, and he's like, "You want me to make jewelry?" Yeah, I do. My customers do. Sorry.
Out of curiosity, a curing time that you let the soles of your plane sit. If I remember correctly, a big problem with Stanley plane had after the war is that they pumped them out so fast that they sit for.
Well, yes, but the term for that is stress relieving. And stress relieving can be done in various ways. You can leave them outside for 2 years, or you can, I used to put them in an oven and then in a freezer, mimicking the seasoning thing. And I did that with bronze right from the get-go. There's a couple of the bronze tools I made in the beginning were rabbit type planes, and they had an opening on one side. So the sole could easily do that. And I wanted to make sure it wasn't going to do anything. So what we do with the iron castings and typically with everything else is the bodies. Is they're heated up in an oven at the foundry and held for the right number of hours, not a whole day, and then cool off very slowly. And that's another thing. If you, well, we also powder coat. Okay, so when we powder coat, it's 350 degrees or so. And one year we went through a whole period of time grinding big planes and wondering why we couldn't get them flat. just struggling. Finally, somebody found out the guy in the powder coat booth was in a hurry, so we tossed him in the snowbank to pull him off. It's like, okay, you don't understand something fundamental about metal, right? So it's stress relieving is necessary. What happens in the machine shop can add stresses again. So you have to be careful about how you machine it. So certainly not letting the casting heat up when you're machining it. Taking multiple passes instead of trying to take it all off at once. Being careful about all that kind of thing, which could potentially add stresses to it. It's really important. So, okay, grinding. Putting a dial indicator on there to make sure we are still parallel with the surface that the blade is on. And if we could go back just a tiny bit, you'll see, I think, that should be anyway. Yes, it's on a angled plate that holds, that supports it where the blade is going to sit. So we're trying to make sure it's kept parallel throughout the process. These are surface grinders. And we have almost as many surface grinders as we do milling machines. We do a lot of grinding. And it's a David Charlesworth, friend of mine in England, went to see Stanley around 2000 sometime in Sheffield, where they sent all their stuff from Britain, although they also made planes in Sheffield for years. And the way they were doing this job was with a belt sander. Okay, so that's not also, that will put stresses in it as well as give you a poor finish. So we take a lot of pains with our grinding. Clean it all up afterwards, take it apart and clean it up. Oil it. Then we have parts, or as they say in Maine, pats. Lots of bronze parts, some other materials. This is a cap iron for that big plane that went around. It's been machined. It's less important to worry about stress on parts like that. Blades, we make our blades ourselves. We buy bar stock and we cut it up and we machine it and we heat treat it. And we also, although it's not showed here, this particular kind of steel, we cryogenically treat. So we take it down to 300 and whatever it is below zero in a tank and leave that for about 48 hours until the liquid nitrogen gas is off, and then warm them up. And well, we don't warm them up, we let them warm up, and then they're ready to grind. The cryo treatment is done after heat treatment, and heat treating is a process of heating them up and hardening them, testing them to make sure that they're hard enough, tempering them, testing them again, cryo treating them, testing them again. Interestingly enough, cryo will sometimes bring the hardness up a point or two, and then tempering them again and test them again, which means hardness testing, and then grinding. And so we grind them on the tops and bottoms to make them smooth, and then we buff the edges by hand and then sharpen them. Of course, the blade is the most important part of the tool.
How long would you expect the blade to last?
Your lifetime.
Yeah.
Well, then I have people who say, hi, glad to meet you. I bought one of your planes 10 years ago. I never had to sharpen the blade.
Right.
Like, okay. It kind of depends, but they'll last a very long time,
How often should you?
every day. Or every day you work. Little bit, often, works very well. Doesn't mean you need to spend a lot of time at it. It's a matter of taking a few minutes. So. Let me check them for square. This is an example of a small part that we make out of brass. That's a lever that goes on that plane to adjust the mouth, the plate. I'm sorry, I should really have explained that. The plate, the purpose of the plate in the front of that plane is so you can close the mouth down on the blade. So you can adjust it wide open for heavy shaving, and then you can make it very small for a fine shaving, which helps you avoid tear out, basically. This is going to be making plane handles, but our saw handles are made the same way. This is a CNC machine, and this one really goes fast. But afterwards, there's a lot of hand sanding. This is cherry, pretty much the diameter of that cutter, yeah. And this is an old-fashioned way. This still works great.
How did you decide the shape of the handle? Did you just mess with one for a long time?
Yes, and therefore all the planes fit my hand just fine. There is yeah, some people have bigger hands, smaller hands. There is that. But yes, it's more the shape that I was interested in, getting it to feel good. And of course, planes and saws, you hold like that. You don't hold like that. So it's 3-finger grip. So it's what may feel like a small handle might not be, like the saw back there. So, but I got some guys working for me who've got baseball mitts for hands, so it does depend. Shaping. So, getting rid of hard edges, making them comfortable to hold. This is as much about the finishing of them as it is about the shape. And I don't think anybody else goes to this kind of length to make their handles. It's actually gun oil. It's a relatively thin varnish that holds up well to moisture, and it takes a nice finish. So with one, I did varnish them at one point. It was really thick, and it wasn't a durable finish. And the oil, the gun oil finish is pretty easy to repair if you need to.
Where's the cherry coming from?
Pennsylvania. I used to use hornbeam for chisel handles, and I lost my supplier and I haven't been able to replace him. That was Maine. That was Maine grown hornbeam. And tonight we just happened to sit down to have a bite to eat next to a small grove of hornbeam trees. Looking at them. more cherry. This is the knob on that tool, which has a metal disc glued to the bottom of it, so it can engage with a lever that moves the plate. And then they're sanded. So in addition to the planes, which is what this is mostly about, we make chisels. And we make saws and workbenches. This is final assembly and inspection. And we make a few other tools that are kind of accessory tools for the tools, like screwdrivers and things.
Saying that, yeah.
Yeah. Then final flatness inspection and squareness. We produce 100 to 150 planes a day, more or less. We produce other tools as well, but this is most of our people work on planes. Most of our effort is into making planes. That is what it's supposed to do. So that's a glimpse into our shop in Warren. If folks are down that way, come stop in and visit.
Yeah, if folks have questions, either for Tom or for Nevan, I'm sure we can take a little bit more time and chat. I'll just turn up the lights a bit so people can see each other.
Questions?
We did a lot of question answering along the way, so that's good.
Is there anyone else doing what you're doing here in the US or in North America?
There are people, so my model was to have a business that produces, and be financially viable and carry on. Okay, so rather than be a guy in a small shop with maybe a couple of friends doing it. So there are some people in that category. In fact, one of the things, when I started, like I said, the tool availability was pretty poor. Quality tools. But also woodworking, kind of comes and goes as an interest that people have. And the better the tools, the more that happens. So when I first started selling these planes, they were 2 or 3 times more expensive than what you could get at the hardware store. Now they're way more expensive than you can get at the hardware store. And it took a while to get over that, for people to get over that. And then since people have seen that people will spend good money on tools, there's a whole other category of tools. Excuse me. There's the category that costs thousands a piece, and there are makers who make a handful a year, and they'll make you a very beautiful plane, and you'll love it. But that's not practical for normal people either, right? So, so there is now a revival of hand tool, not only woodworking, but makers. So there are saws. There are a whole bunch of saw makers. That's because saws are easy to make. You don't need castings. You need a piece of steel and a handle, and pretty much make it back, and that's it. It's easy. You have to learn how to do it and stuff, but it's not like it takes a lot of money to get set up or difficult to figure out. Wooden plane makers are some of those, and particularly making a whole category of wooden planes that I think are vastly underrated, which is molding planes. So molding planes would be, what, you know, the Ford routers and all those things, to make all kinds of complex moldings. So, or simple molds, for that matter, with a simple tool. And a simple tool that you pick off the shelf, set it up, and plane immediately. You don't have any tinkering at all, right? We make a couple of planes that are tongue and groove planes. It's the same thing. They're very specialized. So you pick it up, you make a certain size tongue, that's it, and it does it beautifully. So there's some people doing that. There are some people doing some wooden planes and some infill planes that you refer to on a less than stratospheric scale. Marking knives and stuff like that's a popular thing. It's just, there's a lot more activity, but nobody doing the planes like this. There is a company in Canada that makes planes that are quite good. Still, they're not doing quite what we do.
How do you sell your product? How do you sell it? Just kind of curious. Do you sell it like through
You want one?
catalogs or?
We sell almost exclusively over the internet now. The internet is an amazing thing. No more checks in the mail.
Yeah.
We used to have some dealers. Most of our dealers are now overseas as opposed to in the US. So one way to get our tools in the hands of foreign customers is to sell through a dealer. But also the internet has really has made the world a lot smaller. So we get a lot of business direct from retail customers overseas now too.
Are you seeing, in the last 10 years, are you seeing an increase in home shops? You know, people getting your stuff because they're getting more sophisticated. I mean, do you think there are more people building furniture these days?
Well, all of a sudden in March of 2020, there were thousands of them.
Of course.
I don't know where they all came from. Yes, I think so. But like I said, it comes and goes. It tends to come and go.
I mean, I only ask that because I see a boom in just throwing it like Rockler. They sell tons and tons of stuff. Some of it's okay, but that's not the point. The point is that I think there's a big market out there.
Well, yes, big enough.
Oh, big enough.
And with the power tool thing is probably bigger because it's more appealing to more people. But yes, this is a good sized market.
Well, you know, you stay with it long enough to get to appreciate good tools.
Yes, exactly. But there's, from my point of view, there's more competition now from overseas, which is, you know, not at the quality level, but it's, you know, prices are hard to get. So, yes.
I was just gonna say, I think I wanted to buy a pair of tools from your website I think last year. Had really nice tools, but like you were saying, with globalization, there's just a competition overseas. There's like all sorts of, there's Amazon makes hand planes, and you have Tay tools, and you have the cheap Stanley hand planes nowadays, but
Everybody thinks they're going to get rich making hand planes. Not going to happen. Yeah, there's a lot more. But on the other hand, you know, we've tried hard to educate people, and we go another way that we sell our tools you're asking about is go around the country and do shows, not commercial shows, but our own shows. And we like to go to places like woodworking programs at universities and colleges, guilds, other places where woodworkers congregate, and do mostly demos. How to sharpen, how to plane a board, how to dovetail, you know, these kinds of things, so that people, you know, you might get interested in woodworking, but what are you going to do with it if you don't know how to do things? You got to start somewhere. So we focus hard on teaching people the basics. If you come into the showroom in Warren and you want to ask about a saw and you want to try it out, you can try it out. But you can also get somebody to coach you on sawing, which takes a little, you know, it's not like it's completely innate knowledge. You have to learn, and sharpening being the biggest one. Sharpening is the gateway skill. You have to learn to do that. So, anyway. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you so much.